Oh, he said, okay. All right then. Chapter 2, reading while black. This week, Dr. McCauley takes us through the New Testament and policing, the theology of policing. And starts off with personal story, trip to the Quick Mart, so to speak. And I found this interesting given the furor in Atlanta recently of the Citgo. I don't know how many of you are following that.
I heard about that.
But there's it's a gas station in gosh, where is it? Is it Indicator?
I
People
don't,
saying gotta go. It's a haven for drugs, prostitution, the whole racket. And there've been not riots, but protests. And so he, of course, lived on the north side of Huntsville, Alabama, and apparently was athletic as a young man and thought football was going to be his way into school, and was accosted one night after merely walking over and inviting a group of guys for a party they were going to. All of a sudden, two dark, unmarked vehicles converged on his car, and the interrogation was on. And of course, there was nothing there, and but he was instructing his friends to be cooperative. And it reminded me of the scene in The Chosen when Jesus is arrested, the fictitious story where they come to arrest him the first time. And he makes James and John, everybody, be cooperative, drop your weapons, don't make a scene. So, and he said that he tells the story to highlight the sense of fear, the palpable and real sense of fear that Black individuals have regarding policing. And we know that it's not unique to Huntsville, Alabama. Fortunately, seems to, and by the way, this is not a diatribe against police. He makes it very clear that he is very respectful of police officers and honors what they do. But he is just allowing us to see it from the perspective of the Black individual as well. So this kind of serves as a gateway to open up the discussion about what does the Bible have to say to us, the New Testament particularly, about policing. And I found it a most interesting conversation. He also uses the Rodney King incident as kind of the catalyst for the fear. Of course, the fear was there before. It runs back through history, but this, page 26, he says in the second full paragraph there that begins with Rodney King's name, but then about 3 lines from the end of that paragraph, he said, he says King's beating did not create the fear. Said most of us had our own stories, which might not have been as dramatic, but which still left lasting impressions. He said driving while Black was not a problem, we imagined. And then he points us to an article in the Post, the Washington Post, about you really can get pulled over for driving while Black. And then he goes on to tell the story. So this opens it up for us to talk about the reality of that fear and what does the New Testament tell us. And I like his statement. Freedom is no fear. I mean, to be truly free is to have when we get in our cars, regardless of what our skin tone is, we should not have to be afraid. And we don't have to be. Let me just put it out there. I mean, we don't. I mean, that's not over. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, they blame the fear on the police, but their neighborhoods and all. I mean, this guy, he said before his friends even got in the car, he basically had to frisk them to make sure they didn't have any drugs or weapons or anything like that on to begin with. I'm wondering how much of it is fear based on their neighborhood and they're just blaming the police because the police are there and I hate to say it, but a black person's features do not come out as clear as a white person's does and a lot of it causes the wrong person to be I guess arrested or whatever.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering if most of the fear is from the neighborhoods they live in and they just blame the police. As far as his driving while black, he mentioned in there he'd been stopped 7 or 8 times. I've been stopped 7 or 8 times. I've been profiled at least twice, I know of.
Okay.
And everything. So, I mean, I don't see that much difference in him and me as far as driving, but they blame the police for all of it.
When I see a blue light going off, I kind of, I get a little fearful. Did I do something wrong? Are they after me? I mean, I guess it's just nature,
Sure.
because that's the authority.
Sure. Go ahead, Jen.
As,
There is,
as your-
there is a lot of truth to that. All of us fear.
Go ahead, John.
All of us do fear when we're pulled over. And I do know that in the case of blacks, it has happened more frequently because there's a lot of crime in the world, a lot of crime in Atlanta, and you look at the incidents of black crime and white crime, it seems to be more that we see on the news. Yes, we see murders of blacks by blacks. We see murders of people by whites also. And it's a horrible culture we are currently in. I know myself, being a long-haired, bearded weirdo, that I've been pulled over and I've had to go through the same issues of, okay, I don't have any drugs in the car and I'm fine. But yes, I do understand that there are more instances of when blacks are pulled over. Most policemen are good, but there are some that aren't.
Right.
And the ones that aren't hit the news. I mean, when we look at some of the stuff, the Rodney King thing, he was beat unmercifully, and that was bad. But what caused it was the fact that he ran at a high-speed chase for that long a distance, and the cops were just completely infuriated, and they let their temper go, and they shouldn't have. The same thing with the Floyd incident. Basically, did a counterfeit deal. That's not brought out. He basically, in his past, had put a gun against a pregnant woman's stomach to rob her. He had done some bad things in his life. Maybe he had turned around, but he was loaded up with all kinds of drugs that would have killed you and I. But when he refused to get into the police car, the police then, or the sergeant then acted completely wrong.
Went beyond.
Went beyond what he should, and we have to get that gone. There's no sense in that kind of stuff, but a lot of times the actions of the individual basically cause the reaction from the police.
Mhm.
My dad always told me there's only 2 things I ever said to a police officer if I was ever stopped, and that was yes, sir, and no, sir. Anything other than that, we'd handle later. So it's somewhat of the attitude that not only blacks, but a lot of people have now, the entitlement that I'm entitled to be treated with utmost respect all the time, no matter what I do. If I cuss out an officer, I'm still entitled to be treated with respect. And that's something that we all need to be cognizant of.
Jan, thank you, John. Jan, you want to finish your statement, please?
Okay, I worked as a dispatcher for 9 years up there in Virginia,
Mhm.
but it was a rural county,
Yes, ma'am.
which means like we didn't have the neighborhoods that you would find in the city. But I did learn with the deputies that when they went into a situation, they carried a lot of fear with them. And we not only had Black communities that they were a little bit hesitant to go into without backup.
Yes.
And we had white communities.
Yes.
Uh, that I think was really, to my way of thinking, is really the reason for a lot of this mistreatment. When police stop somebody, is that the policeman is already afraid.
Yes.
Okay, great.
I agree with Jan. I don't know how many times I've been stopped when I was a teenager. I
Right,
was actually taken to jail.
sure.
But in none of those instances have I ever been afraid.
I got you.
Not a single one. Not the time even when I was taken to jail was I afraid. When I'm stopped, and most of the time I was stopped, I had a suit and tie on.
Right.
And it was always, Mr. Tuggle, do you know you did so and so? No, I did not know. And I never used yes, sir, or no, sir, or anything.
Right.
I rolled down the window, they would say, can we see your driver's license? I would hand it to them.
There you go.
I never used yes, sir, no, sir, and any of that, but I never felt afraid, and they never did anything. I understand the fear of policemen.
So,
And we had policemen come into this facility right here where we're sitting many, many years ago.
right,
It was a father-son banquet, and they were gonna tell us about policing. Well, what they ended up telling us was how much fun it was when somebody they stopped, got out and ran, and they had to run down across the pasture and jump over the barbed wire fence and all
Oh,
that.
sure.
They loved it. You can tell by the way they did that they really loved it.
Oh,
But
yeah.
that's not saying all policemen do this.
no,
But if I can be stopped for going 100 miles an hour in a 50-mile-an-hour zone,
sure.
and I have 2 or 3 times,
Mhm.
and particularly when
So
I had
have
the
I.
red sports car,
Yeah,
you know, it was boom.
I was
like that.
driving a Camaro.
But it's still Mr. Tuggle. If a black person does that,
Yeah,
it's boy, get your blankety blank out of the car
It's
and
true.
put your hands on
Yep.
the hood.
can't be
That's a very
denied.
good point.
Some
Yeah,
of this fear goes back to when Clinton was president. And we passed, with the help of Joe Biden, made that big law. What they did, they used the term then of juiced up bucks, juiced up black bucks.
Yeah.
Right, they were
Right.
on, what do they call this, salts now?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so,
so-
yeah.
So the attitude was that every time you stopped a black person, this was a person who had superhuman strength.
Right,
And
Right.
and as opposed to a white person.
right.
And so they are afraid. I know they're afraid. If you don't think they're afraid, look at what they did in Uvalde.
Yeah,
They
Yeah.
are, they're afraid.
yeah, of course they are. And so, I mean, this stems back to civil rights. It stems back to slavery. It stems back to when they were put on the boats in the first place and made their way across the Atlantic into the New World. This is not something that just started with, like he said, with Rodney King or anything like that. It's real. And so, I've never been afraid. I actually, I've had one ticket since I've been at New Hope. I got it on the Oak Road. It was 5 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. I was headed over here and I got pulled over and I was speeding. I was going down the hill. I was more interested in my donut than I was at what the speed of my car was. I'm being serious. And so I got pulled over. And I was told by the officer, white officer. And I did everything, I did exactly what, I just, rolled my window down every time, not every time, because I don't, that's not been the only time. When I get pulled over, the first thing I do is take my license and put it on my dash. And I put my hands on top of my wheel. I do. I mean, I put my hands up here, especially when it's dark. I put my hands up here and I put it. And, I've told Carol this, it kind of made me mad. You know, he was, and I don't know if he was at the end of his shift or whatever, and I know they have a rough go. I mean, I really do. I wouldn't want to be a police officer, okay? But he told me, he says, you know, I could have your car impounded right now for how fast you were driving down that road. And he was just as rude as could be to me.
Hmm.
And I'm just sitting here and I just looked at him and I said, sir, I said, I'm just on my way to church this morning. I haven't been up all night. He says, well, I just want you to know that there's still a chance that I may tow your car and I could haul you in. I'm just sitting here going, I was speeding. You know, I wasn't going around people and cutting. I didn't say any of that, but I just said, I finally waited. He gave me a ticket and I made my contribution to the Gwinnett County, whatever,
Yeah.
so, but it does happen and he, I think he was just maybe at the end of the shift, maybe it had a bad night or whatever. But I fear what would have happened, honest and true, I do. If my
Yeah,
had been dark.
if you had yelled at him and cussed at him, which you're not gonna
I
do.
wouldn't even have had to have yelled at him, I felt like, but I didn't, I stayed, I really don't, I'm not nervous when I see a police officer. I'm not, it just does not occur to me to be nervous. I mean, if I'm speeding, there's nothing for me to be nervous about. I'm speeding, and so, that's all I can say. But before we get bogged down into whether or not black fear and when driving is real, because I'm of the opinion, and it's just for me. It's just for me. I don't dare to speak for any of y'all. It is real, and
Yes.
it's unfortunate. And it's not all the police's fault. Don't hear that, okay? But it's a reality. It really truly is. And yeah, the neighborhoods are dangerous. But listen to where I was driving. The Oak Road between Sonic and the bottom of the hill, but seeing
I
you
knew
and
it
you
was
know
that
it well,
hill,
you
yes.
know it well. It was going downhill and that's a very nice area. Very nice area over there. But they got to do what they got to do. So, but anyway, all I'm saying is let's move. Go ahead.
It is real.
It is
I-
real.
All of us know that it is real. It has happened.
Yeah.
Our responsibility is trying to be
Right.
as passive in that time as we can,
Yeah,
but it is real.
It
And
is
in
real.
country,
it is real.
they are in fear when they get pulled over. There's no doubt about that.
Oh, that's right.
And they said Brock and Brown. That's also for the,
Yeah, and the fear of the officers and the fear of the people in the car collide.
Yep.
And
Yes.
that can be a very dangerous and hot situation.
Yes.
Yeah, it can be. So, yeah. All right, well, let's move into the New Testament, okay? How's it going in there? Errol, everything all right? Well, never mind. She's engaged. Let's look at Romans 13, 1 and 2. Boy, has this been bandied about recently.
oh, yes.
Yeah, okay. Romans 13, 1 and 2, bottom of page 28. Let me read the text there as he has it at the bottom of the page. He says, let every person, this is Paul, of course. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God, unless it's not the party that you voted for. Oh, but that's not in there. I'm sorry. That was in a different translation. Okay, there you go. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. By the way, in Rome, there was no voting. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. And what the reason he's doing this is he's going to talk about the limits that God places on the treatment it seems to be a productive place to begin to speak about the limits that God places on treatment of its citizens. All right, so if you look with me at the top of 30, the focus of the passage appears to be individuals, not the state. Furthermore, Paul tells those individuals to submit to those in authority because they have been placed there by God. Those who resist these authorities run the risk then of opposing God's will. Paul's lack of qualification here has been a cause of concern for many, right? All right, so I'm going to turn this over to you guys and let's have a discussion about this. Yes, sir.
I think that the context here is really important.
Mhm.
Having been in the Middle East. And particularly with Jewish people.
Mhm.
If you look at the Jewish history, all of the governments that the Jews had been subject to had been instituted by God. The Babylonians taking over was God's idea.
Old
The
Testament's
Assyrians
pretty
taking
clear about
over
that.
was God's idea.
Yep.
We don't know. There is no Jewish history of the Greek conquest of the Middle East.
Right.
But it is reasonable, and it looks like from everything they did, they assumed that that was a part of God's plan too.
Yeah.
And then when the Romans come and took over the Greeks, that it was all a part of God's thing. They're thinking, most scholars believe, contributed to the passivity, the passiveness that the Jews took during the Holocaust.
Right.
They did not fight back because this was a government instituted by God,
Right.
and they were something wrong. And it runs, it's not just a Jewish thing, it's sort of a Islamic thing too.
Sure.
In that there was a woman back around the first time before World War I who dressed like a man, who infiltrated into the Arabs. Like, I wish I could remember her name. She actually went to Mecca and was inside
Wow.
where the thing was and got away with that.
Wow.
But she told the story of being with this group of Arabs, and they were on a trip, and some bandits came and stole some of their camels
Mhm.
during the night. Well, the next morning they got up, prepared their coffee, and did all of this, and she says, and they think she's a man, why are we not going to get the camels back?
Mhm.
And the answer was, it's the will of Allah. If it's his will that we get the camels back, no matter how far ahead of us they get, we will get them back. If it's not his will that we get them back, then no matter how quickly we go, we won't get them back. It's all God's will. And that was a lot of the way that Lawrence of Arabia fame found the Arabs to be during World War I when they were trying to fight the Turks. It was like they didn't want to get in a hurry to do anything. It was all God's will. That's not the same thing as what the Jewish thing, but out of that Holocaust situation, the Zionists had come into existence around the turn of the 20th century or 1900s, but they used that passivity, and without them turning it on its head, there would not be the state of Israel today.
Sure.
And so what they did basically was said, not all governments are instituted by God. We're gonna put our own in here. And that's pretty much what happened. So I think from Paul's standpoint, though,
Mhm.
all the governments that the Jewish people that ever had any history with have been instituted by God.
Mhm. And his point is, and if you look with me at 31, the big question that comes out of all of this, because this passage gets a lot of criticism. The big question is, very first line, top 31. The reasonable question, why a good God who is sovereign over all would allow evil rulers to come to power? And then he states it differently. The question is not about our submission to wicked rulers, but their very existence. So he frames this in a question of theodicy, which is the justice of God. The criticism of Paul, then, when Paul gets criticized for this passage, it's a justice of God question. Okay. Asking what we are to do when those tasked with governing us use that power to do harm is really simply another way of asking why there is harm at all. And that's a decent question. One response to the problem of evil has been to posit the cross, he says, and resurrection. It's God's answer to the question. And then you can read the rest of, you've already read that. But then the very bottom of 31, he says, we've drifted from Paul here when we go there. Okay. Does the apostle have anything to say about how the state treats its citizens and our public response to that treatment? And he says, yes. And then he says we need to read these passages of this passage in light of 4 realities. Paul uses Pharaoh in Romans as an example of God removing authorities through human agents. It shows that his prohibition against resistance is not absolute. Okay. Secondly, the wider Old Testament testifies of God's use of human agents to take down corrupt governments, and you only need to read the Old Testament a little bit to know that. Third, in light of those first 2 propositions, we can affirm that God is active through human beings, even when we can't discern the exact role we play. And then finally, the conclusion of this is Paul's words should be seen as more of a limit on our discernment of what God's up to than on his activities. Okay. And I think that's just the mystery thing. But I want to turn it over to you guys because you read this. So going forward, let's hear what you got as far as these 4 things that he posits.
Well, you've already heard that on the.
Oh, yeah, we heard you, buddy. Now, he does say over on 33, he says that the last full paragraph there begins, I maintain. He says, I maintain then, and this is after he goes through the Pharaoh and Moses thing. And by the way, Moses was a murderer. He did resist the authorities. He did. He didn't submit. He resisted, right? But then he maintains that we read Romans 13, 1-2 as a statement about the sovereignty of God and the limits of human discernment. We are allowed to discern and even condemn evil like the prophets did. We are allowed to resist like the Hebrew midwives, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nonetheless, we cannot claim divine sanction for the proper timing and method of solving the problems we discern. All right. And then he says, again, this does not place limits on our ability as Christians to call evil by its name, but it does obligate us to be willing to suffer the consequences. And here it is, of living in a fallen world. We recognize that the state has been given its responsibilities, and we are not anarchists, but we do recognize that the state is, in fact, under God. The state has duties, and we can hold them accountable, even if it means that we suffer for doing so peacefully. And that was a hallmark of the early church. It really was. And this suffering is only futile if the resurrection is a lie. And if the resurrection is true and the Christian stakes his or her entire existence on its truthfulness, then our peaceful witness testifies to a new and better way of being human that transcends the endless cycle of violence. Paul then in Romans 13, 1-2 is not far from Jesus, who tells his disciples that those who live by the sword die by it. So, okay. I found, by the way, I'm just going to go ahead and say I found this whole discussion of policing the empire. And again, I couldn't help but think of the Chosen. And that one dude, the special policeman, the secret policeman, whatever his name was, Ringo or whatever, I don't know. Yeah, whoever. Yeah, but the secret police. But before we get there, so how do we do this? Man. Go ahead.
I think that Martin Luther King had the idea. He got it from Gandhi also. Peaceful resistance. He didn't advocate violence, but he stood behind what he did. And those marches were so significant in our history. And basically that's kind of leads us back. Jesus didn't go pick up a sword and cut off the ear of the guy that was arresting him.
Yes, sir.
And we need to remember that we still have to love one another, even though if the other is being an idiot.
Right.
It has bugged me no end that on Facebook, they keep saying, you will get my respect when you earn it. It's not true. We should give respect first.
Mhm.
Then if it is disearned, that's different.
I like that. That's good.
I've always found that you receive the respect that you give. So like has been said, you have to give the respect first
Yes.
to expect to receive it.
But and realize they're children of God, and that's why,
Yeah.
they've been created in his image, therefore we are to respect everybody,
That's
all
a
of us.
wonderful point. Everyone has the imago Dei, the image of God. Good. Yeah, that's good. That's great. Yeah, go ahead. Wade.
There are only two countries in the world
Yeah.
where peaceful civil disobedience have affected change.
Yes, sir.
The United Kingdom and the United States.
That's right.
Nowhere else did that happen.
No.
Imagine what would have happened to Martin Luther King Jr. in Germany
Yeah,
or in Egypt or Saudi Arabia.
I know what would happen to him.
Now, I'm about to show my ignorance.
Go ahead.
What about the Union of South Africa?
The thing is, they did not do it there, and it was not necessarily the civil disobedience that was affected against the United Kingdom was India.
Right.
But the United Kingdom created the first concentration camps as we know concentration camps today.
Yep.
And it was against white people,
Okay.
against the Afrikaners who were Dutch.
Oh, I got
They
you.
lived in South Africa, and they came in and they rounded those people up, put them in concentration camp. They killed women and children. They did no, I don't know whether there was civil disobedience ever involved with the Afrikaners or not,
Sure.
but they certainly fought. The Boer War was the battle between the Dutch and the British. And that was the war where Winston Churchill went to cover and came back and said, there's nothing like being shot at and missed to clear one's mind.
This is true. Yeah,
I
really.
would think so.
And we did concentration camps too.
Oh, I
Yes,
know.
yeah.
We just
With
weren't
the
first.
Japanese.
We did it in World War II.
Oh, yeah.
And we did it, we didn't call it that, with the
Indian Wars.
Indians.
Yes,
Mhm, Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we did.
yeah, we still do.
Yeah, we do. So, and remembering that this is individuals that we're talking about, and Paul is talking about how individuals, we're not talking about nation to nation as far as how they conduct their business with each other. And so, but yeah, I think Paul's words provide guidance, for us here, that our lives are to be shaped. I mean, Jesus, one of the last things he said to his disciples before his crucifixion, you put the sword down, because if you live by the sword, and that was shown in the life of David as well. And we could just name the ruler after ruler. That was true. Okay. A fascinating study in policing the empire. Romans 13, 3-4, page 34. Let me read this one as well. We're good. Paul goes on to say, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid. For the authority does not bear the sword in vain. Okay. And then I'm looking over here on page 35, where he says, it is the state's attitude, not the soldier officer as a vocation, that stands at the center of Paul's concerns. He states it differently. He says, Paul recognizes that the state has a tremendous influence on how the soldier or officer treats its citizens. Thus, if there is to be a reform, it must be structural and not merely individualistic. This is grounds in a democracy for a structural advocacy on behalf of the powerless. And then secondly, Paul says that the government should not be a source of fear for the innocent. This problem of innocent fearfulness continues to plague encounters between Black persons and law enforcement, excuse me. Again, Paul's words provide guidance on the shape reform must take. What Esau is saying, that Paul is saying, is that reform needs to start with the institutions themselves, that the attitude of the institutions must change. And then that attitude will change or will at least help to change. You can't, so you're gonna have rogue officers. I mean, whatever. But the majority of them, that they get this attitude from above.
Yep.
So he's what he said. Go ahead, and
What I'm gonna say is that, these institutions are a representation of the people that they, cover. So you still get back to the individual, you've got to, change the individual to change the institutions. It's like I guess a circle, just everything just keeps building on itself.
There's something,
We remember two things in the.
just a second, John, go ahead.
Two things in the chosen. One was the guy who was doing the spying out there. Really was a counter-terrorist guy,
Mhm.
which would have been what we would have called CIA.
Right,
All right, the soldier that was with Matthew every day,
Right.
when Matthew collected the taxes, the soldier was there to beat up or kill somebody that would give Matthew a problem.
right.
And so in that time, there really was no like uniform policeman.
Mhm.
The military was the police.
Right.
There's still countries in the world where the military is police in
Right.
Central Africa.
Mhm.
And I don't know of another country other than the United States that has codified the law where that the military is not to be used against civilians.
Right.
I don't know, but I know they can still do it in France, and I think they can do it in the UK, but in the United States,
Right.
they're not to do it. Now, we've had instances where governors, Paulus was one of them, who brought in the National Guard.
Yep.
And Eisenhower, I believe it was Eisenhower was president then, whoever was president, nationalized the National Guard, and then they had, because then they were federal troops, they had to come out. So, the police thing, where police is separate from the military, is fairly it's a Western thing,
Yeah.
and it's fairly recent, in
Sure.
a couple hundred years or something like that,
Okay.
so.
Hey, John, you want to chime in, but go ahead.
well, I agree with Hoyt is that soldiers make horrible policemen. But
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of a soldier is to kill the enemy. Idea of police should be to protect the society. But one thing that we have changed that is coming about is that the police officers are being encouraged to wear the video cameras. And I think this is a good thing because it not only shows what they're doing, but it also protects the officer so that he doesn't be accused of something he didn't do.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that happens. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Good, good. All right, I want to move us across the chapter. Unless you've got something that you want to talk about there, because I thought his little caveat at the end, beginning on page 42. For John the Baptist. Using the witness of John the Baptist and to talk about the responsibilities of police officers. And we all know that the Roman soldiers could basically make any of their subjects do anything they wanted them to do at any point, and if they didn't, you remember what Jesus said about it? If they make you go a mile,
Go to.
go two. Go two. But before Jesus, John comes out as this voice. And I like what Esau says here at the bottom of 42. He says, the voice in the wilderness prepares us for the advent of God. And that raises the question of the identity of the coming king. But John's call to repentance is a command to prepare for God's coming. To refuse to change, in John's estimation, entails missing out on the new exodus to a new inheritance that Jesus will accomplish. And so, looking there at that second paragraph on page 43, John gives very practical suggestions to different groups. The one we'll focus on is don't extort money, he says to the soldiers or police officers. Don't extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation. Be satisfied with your wages. So we go back now, he brings it full circle. He says, if Romans 13:3-4 focuses on the responsibility of the state, then Luke 3:14 gives us a picture of the individual law enforcement officers' responsibilities. And he's going to look at three things: policing and power, policing in the image of God, and we talked about that, and policing and money. And he begins at that very bottom paragraph. He does ask if these are Jews or Gentiles. Most likely they're Gentiles, more than likely. They could be either one or two, but I think they're mostly Roman soldiers here. He says John begins by condemning extortion, and extortion goes beyond mere bribes. Extortion involves using your power to prey on the weak. Extortion is only possible when the extorted have no recourse. So John was concerned with a form of policing in which those who have power, because remember, the officer is always the one that's in power. I mean, period, regardless of attitude or whatever, color, whatever, they are the authority. It says they use power as a means of pursuing their own agenda at the cost of those most at risk. So for this reason, John's criticism of false accusations should not be separated from extortion, because false accusations often undergird extortion. So he says if the people being extorted refuse to comply, they might find themselves accused of crimes that they didn't commit, right? Jay?
Going back to Jews or Gentiles,
Yeah.
back when I joined the sheriff's department, just
Uh-huh.
before I joined, they had hired the first black deputy in the history of the
Oh,
county.
wow.
And this was something that they were forced to do, but the man they hired fulfilled all of the things that are good.
Yeah.
In other words, he was in the job for the wage. He didn't throw his weight around or anything else
Yeah.
like that. But when you say, was it Jews or Gentiles, and dismiss it? No, that's right back there to when Joe Wood was hired by the sheriff's department.
Well, I wasn't being dismissive.
Oh,
These-
okay.
These are
I'm
most
sorry.
likely Gentile police officers.
Well, yes, they were, as most of my, all of the rest of my deputies were white.
Right.
And it did make a difference. It
Sure.
absolutely did, because he influenced the white deputies.
Right.
His actions.
I'm glad. That's great.
But it also
That's good.
goes back to the fear thing.
Yes,
The black policemen are just afraid of stopping black people as white police.
Yeah, they are.
oh, yeah,
And I went to school with a group of black police candidates. They were they were in it for the right reason. They were good and decent people.
Yes.
But I know, and I saw one of them on TV that really was violently pulled out a black person out of a car and hit them and all that kind of
Right.
stuff. They are just afraid as white people or white policemen are of black people.
Yeah,
It's a fear thing.
it
really
is. Yeah, you're right.
okay, but my point was that having the downtrodden be a member of the police force. And in that county, it was Jim Crow all the way. He was downtrodden, but that gave the other deputies, the other powers, a look at what they were really dealing with. Okay,
What they actually are.
I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, Atlanta has pretty much.
Yeah.
The guy, the white man that was in charge of the Atlanta Police Department for years was a guy named Tuggle.
Okay.
And after Tuggle was replaced and the black people started being policemen, things changed. Crime in itself may not have gone down.
Right.
Because the city was growing more and more rapidly. But the treatment of black people changed in Atlanta.
Yeah.
After Captain Tuggle left.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. That's good. I think one of the most important paragraphs in the whole chapter is on page 44, and it's the second, it's the long one. I feel like we should read it. John also might have in mind a soldier offering up a person for a crime. to satisfy the whim of their superior or to achieve some political end. This giving over of bodies as sacrificial offerings for the maintenance of the status quo denies the imago Dei in each of us, the image of God. The story of Jesus' crucifixion contains the paradigmatic false accusation. When John's gospel recounts Pilate's unintentionally profound words at Ke Homo, behold the man, it speaks to Jesus as the one true human who came to restore us all. At the same time, John makes it clear that even as an innocent person condemned to die, Jesus is in fact a person. This is the black claim on the conscience of those who police us. See us as persons worthy of respect in every instance. Jesus' treatment by the soldiers strikes us as egregious because he was innocent of the charges. But do the guilty deserve beatings and mockery? Matthew 27:27-30 speaks to how a corrupt system can distort souls of those charged with functioning in a broken system. John calls on those in that system to rise above the temptation to dehumanize and act with integrity. When I read this, I thought of the scene of the flogging at the Passion of the Christ. And the pure glee that those inflicting this vicious beating upon Jesus, they were really enjoying this. So much so that after they beat him to a pulp, the guy in charge told him to turn him over. And then they started beating him again.
Yep.
And and I know that there are differing opinions on the Passion of the Christ. But one of the things about it that is striking is just the evil in their eyes. As they just beat this man to death. And they got permission to do that from the state. The state trained them that way.
Yep.
And so that's Esau's point, is regarding the institution. And in this chapter, and in this paragraph, is even if the person is guilty, nobody deserves to be beaten. Nobody deserves to be mocked. Nobody. Oh, justice, sure, but not humiliated.
And even if they resist,
Yeah,
there has to be a limit by the authority given to them.
yeah, you're right.
You know, resistance has to be dealt with, but you can't kill somebody or
Oh,
beat them to an inch of their life, even if they resist. You just have to contain them.
yeah, yes, sir. The best you can. Yes, sir. So I think that's important. Yes, sir. Hoyt.
That next to the last sentence,
Go ahead, buddy.
where it says, Matthew 27:27-30 speaks to how a corrupt system can distort the souls of those charged with functioning in a broken system.
Uh-huh.
Data has shown that many of the guards in the Nazi death camps would go home or go to barracks and become intoxicated overnight. And so that was the only way they could make it through to what they were doing. That they, even though they may have been evil and cruel and everything, that it did affect their psyche. What they were doing did affect their psyche.
Yes, sir. I don't see how it can. I
Yeah.
really don't. There's something like that. I really don't. Okay, so let me move to the conclusion and then we'll be done. As he says, we've only scratched the surface. And I'm looking at down here. He mentions Romans 9:17, which demonstrates that, we're stewards and that stewardship involves police work. Therefore, those who rule countries are responsible for the culture of policing that they encourage. As Christians, it is part of our calling to remind those charged with government of their need to create an atmosphere in which people are able to live without fear. This has been the Black person's repeated lament. We should not live in fear. Good should be rewarded and evil punished. The United States historically and in the present has not done that. Instead, it has used the sword to instill a fear that has been passed down from generation to generation in Black homes and churches, but that fear has never had the final word. Instead, Black Christians remember that we need not fear those who can only kill the body. At our best and most Christian moments, we have demanded our birthrights as children of God, and we think MLK and situations like that. But that right should not be purchased at the price of our blood or mental health. A Christian theology of policing then is a theology of freedom. If Paul spoke to the power of the state and the sword, the Baptist turned his eye toward the individual soldier. He called them not to heroic feats of physical bravery, but to heroic virtue. He reminded them that their power need not turn them into villains who exploit. They could become champions for the weak. A Christian theology of policing then looks to the state and calls it to remember its duties. It looks to the officer and demands that said officer recognize the tremendous responsibility and potential of the work that they do. If we undertake this task of calling on the officer and the state to be what God called them to be, then maybe the hopes of Black folks as they relate to the police in this country might be fulfilled. I think it's a very hopeful note to end the chapter on.
Yes.
And it's a very real situation. Okay, and just when you thought we were going to slow down, here comes chapter 3, the New Testament and the political witness of the church. So have fun with that. And any other comments before we go?
In
Go ahead.
France,
Yeah,
the population is very anti-police. They are very disrespectful to the police.
okay.
A gendarme comes up and says something, they jump in his face, her face
I
is
hate
right
that.
off the bat. It's the only place that I've ever been where I saw that kind of reaction.
Wow,
But it is, you go to Paris and,
I
they
hate
they'll
that.
get right in their face and just jump all over them. I don't know how they've been able to get away with that.
Those doggone French. Good thing they never had anything to do with our, go ahead, John.
Look what happens to our police officers so often when they start their duties. Everybody pulls out their phones and takes pictures of them and, videos what they're doing.
Yeah,
And sometimes those videos don't portray what really occurred before
Don't
their
give the whole
actions.
story.
They don't give the whole story. Reminds me of an incident recently where two individuals were in the park after closing
Right.
towards midnight.
yeah.
And it was posted how excessive force the police had. But it's lucky the police officer had a body camera on. And it showed what this person did prior to that and
Right.
resisted all the time. So his actions, basically, I could not be a police officer. There's no doubt in my
No, he
mind.
couldn't.
Neither, but for different reasons.
Yes,
But yeah,
I couldn't do it.
right,
But he was polite the whole time and justified in what he did
sure.
when he arrested.
Yeah.
And handcuffed them.
Boy, go ahead, buddy.
We need to recognize one thing is that, and I can't remember now what it's called, but there's a phrase that describes it. Where in most all cases, policemen are not held accountable for killing somebody.
Right,
In other words, you can have an altercation with a policeman, turn your back and they can shoot you in the back and it's not murder. But if you are an individual, you have an altercation with somebody and they turn their back, you shoot them in the back, it is murder.
yeah. Yeah, it's a weird world. Go ahead, John. John's leaning in.
That's the reason I always turn them around before I shoot them.
There you go. That's a good rule of thumb, man. That's good. Hey, before we go, we want to just say congratulations to Hinton and Linnell's grandson, Mason, who will be baptized tonight at 6
Awesome.
o'clock. So we want to wish them a wonderful evening together with him. And it's been a wonderful discussion, and I thank all of you for being a part of it. And Lord willing, we'll do this again next week, okay? God bless. Bye-bye.